And there's still nothing.
Okay. Are we live?
Oh, here
Uh,
it says something now.
okay.
Yes, it works.
Are we live?
We're live at least on YouTube.
Okay.
Let's see if we're
Did
live
you
on.
did you disable something or?
I did, yes.
Ah, okay. So my YouTube is not live, right?
Uh, okay, now I have to stop because I'm hearing myself all over the place. Sorry, guys, whoever's joining us here, we're having some major issues with the technology. We're trying to set up a live stream with the software service that we've never used before. So it's taking us a good minute, well, more like 22 minutes so
22
far,
minutes, yes.
to try to sort it out. And it seems like it's not working anywhere. It seems to be working on Facebook, not on Facebook, on YouTube.
Okay.
So I'm going to just post some notes to let people know in the other platforms
Ah,
that join
yes,
us in
please.
YouTube. YouTube.
Also, on my YouTube, can you post it as well?
Yes. So we seem to be getting somewhere, so that's good. uh, and for some reason, it's still not quite working on Facebook. I'm just checking the data here
Refresh it.
to make sure, because if there is a way to make it work, that would be great. Okay, now I'm trying to find, where would I find your link, Alessandro? I think I had it open somewhere.
Ah, wait, I can
Ah,
send
I
you.
found it.
Ah, okay, cool.
Actually have it open. Just writing. Oops, I posted the wrong thing.
Something embarrassing.
Just some code
Ah, okay.
for streaming. So I now have to find my own stream. YouTube.com, my channel, live. Here we are. Hi everyone. So some people are here with us. Thank you so much for bearing with us. There's actually 12 people watching right now. Again, I really appreciate it for you guys to be sticking around. And I'm just going to write on the Facebook page as well. On Blender for computational design. Technical difficulties and are only managing to stream to YouTube. Please join us over at okay. Yeah, I don't think the other thing will work. So I posted it in there. Great. Okay, so we
Okay,
can
we have
start.
one channel. That's great.
we we managed one. Yes, true. Much better than none. Guys, we want to open this up to you. So Alessandro and I, as you know, we're quite seasoned professionals that use Blender for computational and architectural design. And correct me if I'm wrong, Alessandro, but both of us tend to use it quite often. Maybe
Yes.
like it's a very essential part of your toolkit, right?
No, definitely, definitely.
Yes, and it's pretty much the same for me here. So I want to open this up, and we actually it was Alessandro's idea. Thank you so much for that. To try to get these live streams happening to see what kind of questions the community might have in regards to workflows. How do you maybe you might have questions of how you incorporate Blender into a wider pipeline for architecture design, or you have some very specific question maybe for a modeling technique or something in regards to tissue, or you might just want to ask us anything. Well,
Yeah.
not everything, I won't tell you my
Let's
kid's
not go.
birthday, but
Let's not go too personal, but
yeah.
every
So,
Blender related question.
yes. So Arkit says hello. Hi, Arkit. Scoop says yes. Amir Ahmed, hi, everyone. And Langtim, hi. And Onur says hi. So, yeah, hi, everybody. So, please let us know if you have any questions.
Yeah, if you don't ask anything, we will just ask things to each other.
I have plenty to ask you,
Yeah, no,
Alessandro.
indeed. I also had. Actually, we had some conversations, and we say actually we are maybe exchanging some interesting pieces of information. Maybe other people may be interested in knowing them. So I say, okay, let's do the live, so that people can also ask other things or I don't know, comment in any way.
Yeah. Cool. Well, nobody's asking anything so far. So, Alessandro, what is your typical design workflow? How do you start out a concept when you're working with
Hmm.
Blender, or not even with Blender, just in general? How do you start out your?
It really depends because I mean I coming from a architectural background, but not everything that I do is architectural. Actually, just a small part of what I do is architecture, and it really depends. I cannot really say that there is like a usual way that I use to approach some project. But what I do in general, what I do is if I can use Blender, I try with Blender whatever I have to do, and I see if I can do it.
Mm,
And if I find some workflows that are kind of easy or are nice to sketch using modeling in Blender, modifiers, a little bit of tissue, then usually I start that. Then, as you know, I'm also using other softwares like Rhino and Grasshopper, which I use a lot as well. But usually I start using them when this is required. Maybe I have to do some NURBS modeling, or I have to do some node stuff that is not really something that I can do with geometry nodes, but maybe it has to be done with Grasshopper. So then I move to those softwares. But usually, I mean, I develop tissue, so I usually try to find solutions that involve tissue, but not because I have to use tissue uh, in any condition. It's just because when you are a hammer, you see nails everywhere. So so when I have like something in mind, I always try to figure out like a way to tessellate it, or I don't know, to use some of the tools that I am developing. So but yes, I think this doesn't really answer to your question. How do I start? Usually, I'm not really a sketching person. I don't start a lot with hand drawing, even though
hmm
I have quite a background in enjoying hand drawing.
Okay.
So usually, what I do, I really start doing some sub-D modeling in Blender and
Yeah.
try some tessellation. And I mean, I have my aesthetic that I'm developing, so usually I tend to stick to some specific workflows like tessellation along the loops, or heavy use of modifiers such arrays, mirrors, and those stuff. But it really depends because sometimes I do a bracelet, sometimes I do a concept for a building, sometimes I do some digital fabrication project.
hmm
That's really difficult to just figure out what is a common approach that I use, to be honest. I don't know. Do you have a kind of routine or like a series of steps that you follow, a procedure when you design?
Well, usually I start with a plane, right? and then and then I start creating a couple of loop cuts and pulling and pushing those points and extruding things, and then yes, mirror and array.
Okay,
And
yeah.
then more often than not also using tissue, to tessellate in some kind of way. But I know for you it's very much about the tectonics of a
Hmm.
component
Yeah.
for uh, whether it's like structure, right, or some sort of component that has to fit very well together with another component to make the
Hmm.
whole thing stand up. And for me it's more about a more traditional typical architecture workflow, right, where I'm looking at the facade, and usually that's the more intricate part, or the massing. So the massing can start in any way, and I mean Blender's tool set, as you probably know, excels in just creating massing studies. And now with
Yes.
geometry nodes, we have some embedded um, BIM, let's say, like a little bit like Grasshopper, where we can calculate maybe floor areas of the different floors that encompass the massing. So I can tweak that a little bit. So yeah, maybe there is a very prescribed workflow. It's typically start with the massing,
Hmm.
then add some floors, and then work a bit on the facade. But I usually have like a good idea about what I'm trying to do with like a specific building project before I delve into it. And with me, it's very much about sketching. Actually, it's I always start with a hand sketch and then move forwards. I mean, my hand sketch is chicken scratch, and in fact, recently I showed my wife my sketchbook of a specific sketch, and I said to her, can you imagine what this will look like once it's complete? She said, yes, but only because I know how you work. Otherwise, it just looks like, something a 5-year-old probably drew in their sketchbook.
Yeah, I see.
So we have a question from Scoop. Andre has also joined us. So hi, Andre from Brazil. Scoop says, "How and why did you start with developing tissue?" And it's awesome. And maybe Scoop, I should also say that we have recorded a podcast with Alessandro, where he does go into detail. That one is very much in production. So maybe Alessandro, you give the short and sweet version if it exists.
Yeah, yes, I guess. I mean, first of all, tissue, I mean, it came from the frustration of a workshop that I did. And it was a workshop about modeling in Blender and integration with Grasshopper. And the workshop was fine. It didn't have any problem. But I realized that working with a Grasshopper and a procedural logic sometimes takes a lot of time to master it and use it for making cool stuff. So I was seeing that, I mean, the students were doing, of course, the beginner things because we were learning the software. But I saw that, for example, there are some workflows like repeating a module along a surface that are quite common. And I mean, it's a very simple workflow that you can set up, but at the beginning you may struggle doing that. So I decided to just make some scripts to automate that part and focus more on modeling, and then getting a final tessellation and explore more of the design, the final design. So that's why I started developing some of the scripts, and I was using them for designing. But I say, okay, um, I want to share them with the community because I'm using an open source software, and I took a lot from Blender and open source community in general. So let's share it. I mean, it's something that I would like to have in a tool. So if I develop a script, why not sharing with someone else and allow other people to start experimenting with this workflow? So yeah, I mean, I just in tissue basically I'm developing all the tools, all the functionalities that I would like to have in Blender. And since basically Blender is a software that is developed by the community, and also the use of the software is driven by the developers, I wanted to push a little bit the use of Blender in a specific field, computational design and architecture. So I wanted to share the tools that, in my opinion, were a bit lacking on that side. So the idea was to involve more architects, more computational designers, and allow them to enjoy Blender and seeing in Blender the things that I was seeing.
And I have to say, I sure definitely enjoy it, So thank you so much for that. Uh, because yes, it makes it much more pleasurable to work, much easier in many
Yeah,
ways.
that that's nice
So
to hear. Thanks.
We have another question from Quinto Gnome. Ciao Alessandro, what are the first or two main features you would like to see implemented in Blender to enhance or improve the modeling task? Would be useful to access the geometry produced by modifier.
Hmm. Wait. Would be useful to access the geometry produced by modifiers. Uh,
You can already access the geometry that's produced by modifiers, but you might have to apply it first, if that's what you mean.
yeah, or maybe it's referring to the possibility to access them non-destructively, which in that case I think would be something possible with geometry nodes because you can select stuff around the flow and maybe in such sense access them. Um, but to answer the first part, what are the first or two main features would you like to see implemented in Blender? I think one is already happening, which is geometry node that has very, very interesting features. Um, Ideally, I would like to have like an embedded real-time update of similar to what you have in geometry node, but achieved with normal scripting that you can do. So, for example, in tissue, you have to press refresh to refresh the tessellations that you're doing, and this is not something that is happening in real time unless you use the animatable option that allows you to every frame refresh your tessellation. That is kind of a hack, but it's kind of working-ish. It would be nice to have from scripting this real-time update. Um, which in some sense you have with geometry node if you intend the use of the nodes as a form as a sort of scripting. So I guess it's getting there somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So that part I think is quite good. um, Other features that I would like to have in Blender. hmm well, maybe, I mean, the reason why sometime I just have to move to Rhino, for example, is the lack of uh, technical drawing tools. I know that there are some add-ons, and probably I didn't really experiment a lot with them, but I guess this could be something that may push a little bit more Blender in the field of architecture. For example, a software like 3D Studio Max, you have like modeling tools that are very similar to Blender, and then you have also the possibility to do some kind of CAD drawing, or at least a simple version of that. In Blender, that part is still a bit tricky, I guess. So it would be nice to see maybe something more on that side, and ideally also on the NURBS side. What do you think, Dimitar?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that can definitely improve in Blender, but for me, it's something more along the basics. So, um, and I think geometry nodes, to go back to your point, is a huge step up in regards to usability of architectural design. For me, what I really want to see, and it seems like somebody's working on that, is proper offset. Because within architecture applications, offset is used a lot, right? And in
Mm,
Blender, it doesn't exist. In Blender, we have like some offset algorithms, but they work with like the normals of points. So, if you have like, let's imagine a radius over here, and you're trying to offset in that direction, and you have, you imagine a point here, 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 and here. So if they go on that, they kind of all crisscross. So
mm,
it doesn't
yes.
work very nicely. But it seems like there's some work from the Blender community for implementing a bevel modifier as a node in geometry nodes, which seems like it could actually address a lot of those offset challenges that exist at the moment. So I think that would definitely help introduce Blender at least a little bit for more CAD-like applications,
Mm,
because I never expect Blender, and 3ds Max doesn't have that either, to have a Rhino equivalent modeling set where we work with a lot of intersections and with with surfaces or with lines, and we're trimming, we're extending, and we're doing that. And that's okay because Blender has its own kind of workflow that's quite useful, but in a different way. Uh, I guess another feature that would be very useful to have is like not so much like proper documentation, because I also think that maybe is outside of the scope for Blender, but software like Blender BIM is picking some of that up. But having a pure wireframe render, I think, is quite important, you know? So not wireframe like being able to see every tessellated triangle, which is what currently happens if you try to create like a wireframe render in one way or another, or not like what is it called? There's a couple of free weight, free light, line weight. I can't remember, but there's some
Like free,
MPR
I don't know,
freestyle.
freestyle.
Yes, yes, and it that doesn't work very well with like very intense um geometry.
Hmm.
So I really wish to see something like V-Rays wireframe
Okay.
only
Actually,
render.
lately for doing some diagrams, I used a lot the grease pencil. I don't know if you have used it.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
I think
There's like a modifier now that
yeah,
creates line weight.
that's really nice. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's not exactly as having a 2D drawing from a CAD software.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, so we have a few more questions here.
Hmm.
So Sid Harton is asking, how can we make geometry nodes more accessible to people, or how can people understand geometry nodes as it is very vast? Where can one start about learning geometry nodes?
Okay. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah. So geometry nodes. One nice thing about Blender is that it has had nodes for a long time. And even though geometry nodes are very different nodes, in some ways it's also quite similar to nodes for creating materials. And when I was learning how to create materials in Blender, there's really one way to learn, which is you watch somebody and you copy step by step what they're doing, and you hope that you get something that's fairly remotely, like at least half as good as what they're showing, right? And you redo it like 50 times, and then maybe you'll get there, right? So I mean, there's what I'm saying is there's no easy way. Luckily, a lot of people are posting a lot of tutorials on utilizing geometry nodes in different ways. I think the basics for, scattering elements is becoming fairly accessible. And by the way, guys, if you think that we should maybe uh, create some kind of tutorial in some of this, it's also a good suggestion to let us know. But for more advanced elements, it does get a little bit tricky. Like I made a video which was thanks to Erin Dale about creating a loft with geometry nodes. And it's not so straightforward. So you must learn that from somebody who, I don't know where they learned it from, They just sort of thought, I guess, that there's no other way. So that's what I would suggest. Do you have any comments on that, Alessandro?
I mean, I think geometry node is a bit complicated, but I also understand why. I mean, from a programming experience, I have a feeling when I use geometry node that is like instead of writing a Python code, you are using NumPy, which is kind of optimized to process the data stream of all your information all at once. And this probably make it more optimized and maybe allows to combine with some parallel computing. I'm just guessing because I'm not sure about that part. Um, but that's why I think sometimes it looks very complicated to do something that in your mind may be very simple. But I think that now we are still probably developing the backbone of a system. So with a possibility to share also group of nodes, you can actually pack a lot of those things into something that is more accessible. So what I see in Geometry Node is that now we're working on this layer, which is a bit more complex, probably for a user that coming directly from a more conventional modeling approach. But I see an evolution in the next months or year in which you will have maybe much more functions that you can relate better if you're coming from a modeling workflow. Regarding the resources, I think there are a lot of tutorials now. The good thing is that there is a lot of hype in the Blender community about Geometry Node, and this create a lot of content because this is kind of an unexplored field. So I think the documentation material is not missing, even though, in my opinion, it looks still like something that is more for a coding mind rather than a modeling artist. Or at least this is my feeling. Sometimes I really see some workflow that say, "Oh, wow, okay, I can kind of get that because I'm coming from programming." But I mean, I don't see like a beginner user to really catch up that easily about with that specific logic.
You know, with geometry nodes, it's interesting, right? Because you have to get the logic of how they work, because there's some kind of automatic convention based on fields
Hmm.
that it works.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of understand the stream of things. But I think in some way the data is much easier to manage than it is in something like Grasshopper, where you have to like and it's hard to judge, right? Because you and I both know Grasshopper
Mm.
quite well, probably for much longer than geometry nodes existed.
Yes.
So it would be useful for somebody that's just starting up to experiment a little bit with Grasshopper on one side and then geometry nodes on the other side, and kind of like uh, think about how the workflow compares between those two.
Mm.
Because when I was teaching Grasshopper to colleagues, creating a line or a series of lines and offsetting things like that and extruding, they all do quite well up to a point. So, the first part they get. But after that, if they have to like mingle with the data and kind of have two streams of data that are matching, they struggle quite a bit to understand what's happening behind the scenes.
Mm.
Blender kind of removes that in a way, so you don't have to think about matching data to that level of precision with geometry nodes.
Yes, but sometime maybe because I'm used to Grasshopper, I want to, and I'm not
Yes.
always managing that. I mean, I'm not a pro user of Geometry Node. I'm really just experimenting. But sometimes maybe I'm biased because I'm coming from Grasshopper logic. So sometimes I have some data and I want to just take them and manipulate easily as I would do in Grasshopper. That is tricky, but this is just like an advanced level use of Grasshopper. Once you get there, I mean, you don't have a lot of problems usually. Um, but yeah, but what I like is that in Geometry Node, what we did was to basically recreate as much as possible the logic that was also in the shaders. So in the shaders, you can do a lot of things combining the textures, the levels, the colors, and manipulating that. And I think they tried to recreate the same logic, which makes sense, which I was actually liking a lot. And I wanted to sometime to just make that happening in the geometry. And so far, Geometry Node is doing exactly that. But some other time, you want to work with a logic that is a bit more different,
Yeah.
and then things start getting a bit trickier.
Yeah, it doesn't have so many options to manipulate data,
Mm,
does it? Yet, just yet.
yes.
There are ways, but they're quite roundabout in a way. Cool. So let's see. There's some other questions here. Um, some people have choices for a new kind of feature. Bevel after Boolean is
There,
one.
there is actually something. I remember there was an add-on that was allowing to bevel after the boolean. I don't remember how it worked though. Uh, I remember I
Yeah,
used a couple of times, but yes, I see now the point of accessing the data in the modifier stack. I mean, maybe you have used a little bit FreeCAD or similar softwares where you're building like a history, a sequence of operations, and then you can just select one edge after a Boolean operation and say, okay, let's bevel this. And everything keeps the parametric nature of the model that you're doing.
in practice, yes. I mean, sorry, in theory, yes. In practice, there is a topological naming that if you change something and the order of your edges changes in FreeCAD, because I've used FreeCAD
Mm,
quite a bit as well. It's a very powerful software. It does need quite a bit more development, and it's completely parametric in a way. And at first, I was really excited exactly about what you said. But let's say you do an operation before that that changes the order of the edges, then you do end up beveling an edge, but it's not the edge you thought you're
mm.
going to bevel
But
because the order changed.
yeah, but maybe you can just reassign it. I mean, maybe it's not a
Yes,
big deal. I don't know.
yes.
But yes, I remember that add-on. Uh, bevel boolean.
There is one, yes. If you go on Blender Artist and you search for that, there is a big thread for bevel after boolean.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was destructive or non-destructive. Do you remember that?
I don't.
Okay.
Okay, so some people have some other comments. So Arcade says, I would like a direct section making tool like SketchUp or Rhino. I definitely agree. That's a very, very important part. So Blender BIM has a section tool, and I don't know if it's still uh, shader based or if something else.
Mm,
The first version of it that Mode created was shader based. So it's what's good about shader based section tool is that it's a little bit, well, not a little bit, it's much faster than a boolean.
yeah.
Okay,
Yes, that's true.
and somebody else says, so Quinto says, will you produce a version of tissue made with geometry nodes?
And that would be interesting. No, actually, I was really thinking at how I can take advantage of the cool features that are in geometry nodes and try to improve a little bit tissue with them. So, for example, there are some features. For example, mostly the one that are related with the vertex groups that can actually be recreated with geometry nodes. So I was thinking that maybe I'm just wondering, maybe some of them they could have like a geometry node option, which will make them completely non-destructive, generating automatically maybe some nodes in the even node tree of geometry nodes. So maybe some of them could be packed as nodes and make available from there. So maybe you use just the interface. So I will keep like the a simplified approach that I try to have in tissue. So the idea of not dealing with the nodes directly, but maybe you click that and you see what you want happening, but under the hood you have geometry nodes and you can still go there and maybe start doing some customization. So I was considering to test something like that, maybe with the vertex groups node. With the tessellation is a bit more tricky because I mean there are a lot of settings and exceptions. That one is a bit more complex to do. But maybe I may consider to just take some part of that and try to recreate with geometry nodes. I have to compare also what is the processing time, if it's convenient or not. I would say that maybe it is convenient because a geometry node is quite optimized. But yeah, that would be actually something nice to do.
There is a couple of attempts actually already at people taking Alessandro's code and creating a tessellation
Hmm.
within geometry nodes. One is a person is just looking at the maths behind what you're doing, and they've created a lot of groups of literally, like the add, the lerps, the subtract, whatever else kind of logic that you're doing, like trying. I guess you to summarize it basically, you have the bounding box, right? And you kind of map that bounding box to each face in a way
Yes.
with normals and things like that and the edges. So that's what they're trying to do. As you were saying, it doesn't have all the options of tissue. And I also know there was, for a while, somebody that was producing a custom version, a custom build of Blender with the same tissue code but hard coded as a node. So using C++ code
Hmm.
into it.
Yeah, I would like to have the knowledge of making myself some nodes, coding them from scratch, but that's a different language. I mean, I could study that, but I think that some people is already quite fluent with that, and maybe it makes sense if someone just take inspiration from the Python code and translate. I would like to have the time to learn and do it myself, but I mean, let's see. It's one of things in the to-do list that sometime maybe will happen. I'm not sure.
I mean, it will be interesting how Geometry Nodes expands beyond the official version produced by Blender, right? Because when we think about Grasshopper, you have fantastic tools that are shipped within Grasshopper, but the plugin framework infrastructure is very important within Grasshopper, right? Like many people relies like a lot on various plugins to expand the functionality of of Grasshopper.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. No, I see something like that happening in geometry nodes. I mean, I see that there are a lot of people that are sharing some quite some rich cluster of groups, and I mean, for some people, maybe they become really a crucial part of the workflow.
We need like a Python node, I think,
That
for
would
geometry
be really
nodes.
nice. Or yeah, maybe for example, if there is the option in geometry node to just execute some pieces of code, then that would make more easy to just script some new features that then you can access from there in real time.
Which
Uh,
is a nice lead to the next question by Kinto as well. Uh, sorry for so many questions. No problem at all. Feel free to ask as many questions as you want. The more, the better, everybody.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
And he's asking if you're involved in the Sverchok framework. It is very fast and powerful. And what will be its future? Will it still be produced?
um, I I had a small collaboration with the Sverchok project. I was actually doing some workshop for 3D printing with clay. So for that, I developed a couple of components for some specific features that I needed, exporting a G code or also reading the data from images so you can like make some patterns on some 3D printed basis. So in that time, I was experimenting a bit with Sverchok, and I was liking some of the features. I think Geometry Node is not gonna replace it because Sverchok is actually closer to Grasshopper. So about the managing of the data that we were mentioning before, Sverchok I think give more access to some of the functions that a Grasshopper user may look for. So I don't see that as something that is going to be replaced. Regarding the performances, I remember that I got stuck a little bit because processing a lot of data sometimes was taking a bit of time, and I'm not using it. I didn't use it in the last year, so I'm not sure about how much this part has been improved. Um, so yeah, I don't know about that. But I remember that doing some comparison with Grasshopper, I was seeing that I mean, the modeling part, maybe some modeling functions and with visualization in Blender was better, but sometimes just doing numerical operation on a lot of numbers was getting a bit more longer.
Yeah, I've used Sverchok as well. It's great. And now they've also incorporated Open Cascade. within it. So if you have FreeCAD installed, you can actually do solids
Oh,
within
nice.
Blender. So it's very cool. It's still expanding. It's very much alive. Uh, the struggle I had with Sverchok personally is that it's in Blender. It's so easy to model, either destructively or non-destructively, that I've actually hadn't had the need to have something a bit more parametric and more procedural and more precise with what Sverchok can do. But for people, I've seen like some really fantastic creations, and yes, it's a lot more similar to Grasshopper, and Sverchok, I think, is the Russian word for cricket. So it's quite similar. I think it's
Yeah, and also the nice thing is that for how Blender works is not like deciding over an environment or another one. Maybe you can use Sverchok for doing some geometry construction, and then you can use the output of Sverchok for as an input for geometry node for doing something else. So I think the integration between the different tools is pretty much easy and feasible.
yeah. So it's and your last part, as mentioned, it's very much still alive and kicking, and I don't think it will stop anytime soon. In fact, if anything, it's growing. You can include not optimal, additional libraries to expand its functionality a lot. And I think uh, to answer your question about speed, I do think they have number or something similar that comes with it as well.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, this is a bit more technical thing, but for example, in Grasshopper, what happened is that the data is processed as dictionaries. So basically, you have a list of data that can have any type of shape and every type of content inside, and then each list has like its own key address. So when you process a lot of them, they are just sorted and compared according to the key, which is the path that you have in Grasshopper. What happened in Sverchok is since it's using NumPy, everything should be processed as a multidimensional array, which will force you to have like a more regular data structure, and also sometimes makes it more tricky to combine different data streams because sometimes they're just not compatible. While in Grasshopper, it's very difficult to get errors because you are comparing data that cannot be compared, because it will always manage a way to compare them. Maybe you will get something wrong, but at least you don't get an error. So that part, I think, was kind of a side effect of using NumPy, because it relies on a more structure and properly defined data structure.
Hmm, interesting. Way over my head for sure. Okay, so Americ asks, I used Subdi, Rhino, and Grasshopper, but I started learning Blender because I needed to animate design process in a scene. Is there a way to connect Grasshopper with Blender, or do I need to learn G-Node and Subdi, geometry nodes and Subdi in Blender? So
Okay,
is there a way to connect Grasshopper with Blender?
there is.
Tell us about it.
Uh-huh. No, it's actually a very stupid and small and old add-on that I developed, which is called Mesh Sync. And what you can do with Mesh Sync is to have like, um, actually, should I show it?
Yes, please.
Yeah, let's do something live. Wait, let me remove embarrassing stuff from my desktop.
And while you're doing that, Paul Barton says, I think Sverchok has a script node. And yes, it does. And I have used it, and maybe it works so well and so straightforward that that's what I really wish that Geometry Nodes develops.
Okay. Say something more while I open Rhino.
Yeah, well, Ben VC is asking about topologic. So do you know about topologic, Alessandro? Do you follow
Mm,
that?
yes, I never used it, but I'm following the project. Do you know that?
I do, yes, and it looks very promising, especially as an open source framework, which is, yeah, it can give us a lot of potential. So I'm out of words, as you can see, about what it can do. Because I'll tell you how I know it. I tried to use FreeCAD last year for a small freelance project instead of Revit. So it's mostly like architecture and interiors. It was like a doctor's office cabinet suite with like a small surgery and some patient rooms and so on. And I was really struggling to do that in FreeCAD, not the modeling part, but the documentation part. One thing is, for example, that I realized that Revit does really well with rooms. So Topologic has a very good algorithm for figuring out either enclosed areas, which could be used for rooms, and also like specific conditions. Like, is this like an edge, let's say, of an external wall? As far as I understand it, and I understand it very, very minimally. It might do way more than what I'm saying, but that's what I see as fantastic potentials. And I also know Topologic is they're producing nodes that are fairly easy to use with Sverchok in
Okay,
Blender.
nice. Okay, I opened I opened my software. Okay, I'm sharing, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, full screen. Okay, so we have here Rhino with Grasshopper, and we have here Blender. So with this add-on, which also has some components for Grasshopper, I mean, this is something that I really developed very quickly just because I need to do some stuff, and I should definitely improve a little bit the performances because it's not super fast. But this is the add-on. It's called Mesh Sync, and has some components that you can use to export things and to import things. And what happened is that is importing and exporting the data just as list of txt files. So something very simple to also interpret with additional software. For example, at the beginning, I was using that logic for processing. So from processing, I was able to read the txt files and rebuild or export the geometry. Of course, there are better ways to do that. That was just the simplest way to do this. So for example, I can say, okay, let's say that we want to export something. What do we export? Maybe we just generate a very basic mesh, like a sphere, and we want to send this to Blender. So here we have a trigger, so we can use a button that will trigger the export. Then we need a path. So we can use a file path. We can define a path. So set new file location. So I can just go to the desktop and do a new folder, live, and I call it my mesh from Grasshopper. And don't remember if I have to put something else. No, maybe not. And okay, save. And now, in theory, if I remember correctly, because I haven't used in a while, actually, in theory, I can export stuff. So if I go to, let's close this. If I go to the desktop and I go to the live folder, which is here, now you see that we have a txt file and two txt files. One just contains the information, the coordinates about the vertices. So it's something very easy to interpret. And the other one just contains as txt the indexes for building the faces based on those vertices. So what we can do now in Blender is to use Mesh Sync, which is an add-on that you can find on my GitHub. And you can decide if you want to import or export stuff. So for example, we want to import something. So we can click on the folder here. We go to the same folder and live. And we select vertices, the vertices one. It will read automatically also the other stuff. We accept. And now we can click on import mesh data. And now we have a sphere from Grasshopper. So what we can do, whoops, I wanted to go here actually. What we can do is we can change something. For example, we can change this value, and then you can export again. And from here, you can import the data again. And since I use a lot of vertex groups, there is also a way to import them as well. So for example, you can have a list that define the weight. So for example, I don't know, maybe I can deconstruct the mesh and take, for example, I deconstruct the vector, I reconstruct the normals, and I export the Z as weight. Now I export this, and from Blender, I import the mesh data, and now we have a vertex groups. And now the vertex group is changing according to the normal. And we can do the same thing in the opposite direction. So let's say that now I want to do some modifier stuff. I do like wireframe, and I do a subdivision surface. Okay, so what I can do now, and also this should produce also vertex group, by the way, which is not visible unless we turn this on. Okay, I guess. Anyway, so what we can do here is we can also send from this object or from another one. And we can choose a file. So we go here again, and this time we call it from Blender, just to use a different file. Accept. And we can decide what we want to send. So we can use the result of the modifiers, which is what we want to do. We can send vertex groups as well. And those are actually some additional topological information. For example, for every vertex, having the vertex neighbors or the face neighbors for every vertex. So we can export the mesh data. And now, in theory, from Grasshopper, we can use from mesh sync import. And there is the simple one that we just import the mesh. But since we have the vertex groups, we want to use the advanced one. So here we can use, I think in this case is a button, toggle, not a button. And here we can set the path. So we can use that component. We set one existing file because we have it. So it can be this one. Okay. I shouldn't use the vertices.txt because now I added another part. Anyway, I can use this. And now I set it on. It's not working because of the naming. Yes, my bad. So let's use here just the name. Okay, let me just delete those. Okay. And now I guess, I hope. Okay. And now we have that. As I was mentioning, it's a bit slow, a bit too much, but it works. So from here, what we can do is to color the mesh, for example. How was that? Call mesh colors. So we can take the mesh and we can define a gradient with some presets like this one. We can take the weight and maybe I will flatten this and I can use as color. And now we see the vertex group mapped here as well. And of course, you can use that for processing things. So yes, this is how you can connect them. I don't know, maybe someone else developed something a bit more efficient. But yes, I mean, I'm planning to make a little bit an update of that, but it should work anyway. Okay.
Very nice. Uh, Is there like specific limits in regards to like amount of data you can send, or is it pretty performative?
No, it's not performative. You have seen it, it was taking a little bit of time just to process that simple object. The problem is that I wrote the grasshopper part in Python, and also probably, I mean, it's an old code, so maybe if I have to do it again, maybe I will find some more efficient ways to export also from Blender. So it's a bit old, but working. I
Mm.
did some updates more recently just to fix some non-functioning uh, things, but yeah, the code could be optimized a little bit more.
So I would say maybe your code is quite good for doing something iteratively, right? So when you have to go backwards and forwards between Grasshopper and Blender, and perhaps if there's something that you know you're gonna hand off, from Blender to Rhino, or from Rhino to Blender, perhaps OBJ might be well faster to export specific elements.
Yes, I remember that. I I didn't use OBJ when I did to do, when I started to develop those features. It
Mm-hmm.
was because or at least at that time, that was the limitation. The OBJ was changing the topological, the indexing of vertices and other element of the mesh.
I
So it
see.
wasn't possible for me to address exactly some specific vertices for doing some operation. Maybe now, maybe there could be an option to preserve that. I'm not sure, but that was the problem that I had at that time.
There is a brand new OBJ importer and exporter which is based on C++, so it's
Mhm.
much faster. It doesn't yet have all the options of the old importer and exporter, but I don't know about the order of the vertices, whether it preserves the topology of the mesh or
Hmm.
it kind of does. That would be an interesting test to have.
Yes. Also, I mean, the nice thing is that you don't need to have both softwares open to keep that link working because it's saving a txt file at the end. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe, I don't know, for example, I was using for collaborating with other people using Dropbox. So I was like exporting the geometries from Blender in a specific folder, and I was just using Grasshopper and reading them directly from the folder. So we were able to also to collaborate between different computers and also offline.
Nice. Very nice. Cool. Okay, let's see if we have some more questions. What do you think about subdivision with vertex group or similar to apply subdivision locally and not globally? Maybe I can answer that question because with geometry nodes, it also has a subdivision surface node. And what you can do is you can start with with geometry, and then in one way or another, you can separate your geometry. So you have one geometry element that you can subdivide then, and then another one that you can keep. The trouble though is that the subdivision surface node in Blender doesn't have many options. For example, there's an option in the modifier where you can keep corners, uh, and that option doesn't exist in geometry nodes yet. So if you create a subdivision, you have to maybe create a loop around the area that you want to subdivide, and then you have to figure out either manually or with geometry nodes how to add creases to those elements around the area so you can keep the sharp corners, so you can only subdivide that mesh. So probably a bit tricky.
You you use also Maya, right? At some point in your life.
Yes, I have.
Okay,
Yes,
I'm not
I.
shaming you. No,
No, Maya is great.
but I remember that Maya had something. that allow to subdivide selectively, or no? Am I wrong? I used like for few hours and
I don't know, to be
okay,
honest. Um,
okay,
I don't think so,
okay,
but maybe it's been maybe 10 years since I've used Maya.
okay. Maybe I'm just saying something completely wrong.
Yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
Okay, no, never mind. Maybe it's not an existing feature. Maybe I just made it up. But I remember that I also had this kind of. I felt the need of subdivide selectively with a subdivision surface. But then I don't know. I just forgot about that need because I don't know. Maybe I got more into the modeling logic, and I just found different ways to handle such thing.
But also you can use tissue for that, right? So you can have like a rough like mesh, base mesh, and then you can create one material or use one panel in one area. Let's say that you have like, I'm always thinking about buildings. So for my case, I'm thinking about a building mass. Let's say it's somewhat twisted, right? And we have like one strip that we want it to have less subdivisions. So we can imagine having a very simple panel, which is literally just a plane, right? A quad face. Next, you can have another panel, which could literally be just as simple, but with an array. So you have like an array in one direction, then and an array in the other direction. So it has a little bit more geometry onto it, and you can use that with the corners where you need a little bit more geometry, and then you
Yeah,
can subdivide that mesh afterwards.
yeah, that's true. Um, you have also to always to think about how they are gonna match with the
True.
neighbors. So maybe you can have a subdivisions in one direction so that if you're working with a very structured mesh, maybe the extra subdivision is not gonna affect the interaction between two consecutive components. Or maybe you can model also a component to handle the transition between them,
Yeah.
so that you have like a bifurcation component that will allow you to process that.
I guess that would always be the issue with subdividing selectively in any case, isn't it? It's how you kind of have that smooth transition between one component to the other.
Hmm. Yes.
Right. So let's see, what else do we have here? Hi, sir. Workflow for learning Blender for architecture, says Ryan. So there's many different ways to use Blender for architecture. I'm not sure if you have like a specific idea in mind. Is it like using Revit, like using Revit or SketchUp or something like that? Maybe you can clarify a little bit more on that. But other than that, if you're thinking of a very typical architecture design process, uh, you kind of start with like a base mesh, or the way I do it is I start with a base mesh, then create some floors, then I would either hand sketch or maybe even draft some floor plans in Rhino, and from that point on continue to generate and modify the geometry within Blender.
I definitely suggest following Dimitar because he's doing a lot of he's creating a lot of contents, I think specifically for that. So I think if you follow him, you may figure out some nice ways to transfer maybe your modeling approach to Blender. And yeah, but I remember the frustration that I had at the beginning. I was coming from like AutoCAD Revit. I say, okay, now I'm start using Blender, and it was extremely frustrating because I had to change completely the way I was thinking the modeling. And so at the beginning, it's normal, I guess, to be a bit confused. Also, I was using Blender. I don't remember even the version was 10 years ago. So now it's much easier, I guess, for a new user.
Yeah, there's a lot more content, isn't there?
Yes. And also functions. I mean, the Solidify wasn't there at the time. So
Wow.
imagine, imagine.
When did the Solidify come around?
I don't remember, but I remember I was still using Radiosity.
I don't know what that is. Is that
Okay.
another word,
Yeah,
Alessandro?
I mean, when there was like the old Blender render engine, Blender internal,
Ah,
For the
okay.
global illumination, you were using radiosity, which was a way to store the lighting as vertex colors, basically. So you were baking the bounces of the light as vertex colors, and then that was your global illumination.
I see.
It was producing massive files and memory usage for very complex scenes.
Yeah, people don't. It's hard to appreciate how far we've gone in regards to rendering in the span of 20 years, but it's a
Yes,
lot.
yeah.
All right. So, is there an animation snapshot in Blender? In Maya, the tool is used for parametric in quotations. By using animation, it duplicates objects or curves as it deforms. It can also be constrained to a curve. So that's one workflow that I do remember because that's what we were told at the AA and DRL to use a lot. So Blender doesn't have that tool like in the same way, but now with geometry nodes you can kind of cheat it. And before that, you could also sort of cheat it with uh, um, I'm forgetting the name now. I have to open Blender to see shape
Anima-
keys. That's
okay,
the
sure.
with shape
Yes,
keys.
but I remember that workflow. I remember seeing that in Maya.
Yep.
I remember me trying to replicate in Blender, but the problem with the shape keys was that the shape key is processed before the modifiers. So, for example, what I was trying to do was to create like an array of elements with shape keys, and I wanted to make this morphing effect, like having a tower that was changing shape while it was rising. But the shape key was changing at the beginning, and then the array was processed to repeat the component. So that was creating, I was losing this morphing effect.
Mm.
So yeah, that's actually why I did some morphing features in tissue, because I couldn't do that with the modifiers. Now with geometry nodes, probably you can do that because you have more freedom of combining the data streams.
Yeah, so you can kind of use one geometry and then use another geometry and then breakcast like your object to the target geometry. And then you can set the position of your vertices to kind of wrap around that geometry. And you can multiply that times a vector of zero point 0.5, let's say. So it doesn't go all the way and it doesn't completely snap, but it has some kind of effect. And you can control that by that vector multiplication.
Yeah, I remember that a destructive way to do that was to like create, I don't know, an array of an object, and then apply the modifier. And then you can do the same thing with an object that has a different shape, but same indexing of the vertices. And you can like apply the modifiers to create like two different towers with different shapes. And then you can combine them as shape keys. And then you can use the vertex groups to define it's how the effect is changing along the geometry. But
But I would.
that was destructive. So
Mm,
I mean, you can still change the vertex groups, but it's not that simple to change the starting module, the starting element.
yeah, I would say that a lot of that functionality is definitely covered by tissue and probably some more, right? Because you can mm, maybe it's not a direct translation of the animation snapshot tool in Maya when you're morphing between two kinds of
Hmm.
objects, but if you break that workflow down to what you're trying to achieve, I am 100% positive that that can most likely be achieved with tissue.
Yeah, I think some of them, yes.
Yeah. Cool. So Stephen Corlas is here. Hey, buddy, nice to see you here. And his question is, how do you document for projects or permitting if you use Blender? So we touched a little bit upon the on documentation or the lack thereof, but there is Blender BIM, which is an add-on for Blender, uh, which is actually called IFC OpenShell, which allows you to directly edit IFC files. So you actually are not importing IFC files to Blender data. The add-on, I don't know how they did it, but the add-on directly edits your IFC file. So it's quite fast. It's a bit of a different workflow, And because I work mostly concept design stages of architecture, I haven't had that much need for it to, let's say, BIMify my model, to add BIM data to, like, let's say, walls and things. But it is quite powerful. You do have to learn a little bit more about how IFCs work, how they're organized, because they do have their own data structure. So you have to understand, like, you always have a site, and on the site you have a project, and on the project you have a building, and in the building you have floors, and in the floors you have walls, spaces, and so on. So if you kind of understand that data, you can go with Blender BIM and tags like elements directly, or use some of Blender BIM's authoring tools. And then I believe now they're also including some documentation tools, which again I haven't used much, but I'll drop a link down to the OSR community where you can follow Blender BIM in a little bit more detail. And it's developing very fast. There's still a lot of missing features, so don't think that this is like Revit, alternative just yet. But like any of these things, the more that people use them, the quicker it will get developed, and people have requests, bugs, maybe more people start to join the coding as well. So there are some options for it. um you probably haven't used Blender BIM, have you, Alessandro?
Actually, no, no,
Yeah.
very little. I tried that, but yeah, since I'm not doing a lot of architectural building and modeling at the moment, I never had the need. I just had once. I remember I was collaborating with a studio. We were trying to find a way to communicate using IFC,
Hmm.
and that was my small shy attempt to use it.
But you do create models for manufacturing, right? I guess in your case it's a little bit different because your documentation is not a vector plan drawing. Your documentation is probably G code for the most
Yeah,
part.
G code sometime or just an STL file, which should have follow some geometrical requirements and then like minimum thickness or some dimensional limits, and then I go with 3D printing. So that part is easier when you work with additive manufacturing.
Yeah. Okay. Some other questions. So Paul Barton asks, you said it was a drastic change in thinking from Revit to Blender. How different is the workflow going from Blender to Rhino?
Hmm. Hmm. Um, no, it's funny because I was teaching in Academy of Fine Arts, and I was teaching at some point both Blender and Rhino, and I realized that some students were in love with Blender and they were hating the Rhino modeling. Some others
Hmm.
were the opposite side. So I created like two factions: the Blender guys and the Rhino guys, and everyone had his own preferences. So what they were saying is that they had the feeling that Blender was more an artistic approach. So they felt it more like a more freedom in modeling with Blender, while they were seeing Rhino as more technical and a bit strict on the procedure of modeling. Um, I, I thought it was more intuitive Rhino because this is how I learned drawing in CAD software at the very beginning. So for me, it was difficult at the beginning to train myself using Blender. But then I found out that if they were starting with Blender, then they were struggling a little bit to enter in the more technical logic of Rhino. But I would say that the main difference, in my opinion, is that when you model with Blender, as Dimitar was saying, you start from a plane, you start from a cube, you start from something existing, and then you start manipulating this geometry, turning it into something that you want to get. So maybe with some subdivisions, you take a cube and you make Dimitar's portrait. While in Rhino, what you do, you start from bidimensional, two-dimensional elements like curves. So if you want to build something, you have to make profile curves or start making the structure of your object, maybe as accurate as possible. And then starting from that, you make the surfaces and you start assembling your model, which gives you a bit more control and especially dimensionally. But at the same time, sometimes it makes more difficult to manipulate it afterward because maybe you have many surfaces, and when you start to change some of them, you lose the continuity between them. So that becomes a bit challenging. So in my experience, Blender is really good for sketching because you can easily manipulate completely the shape, while Rhino, probably if you know exactly where you're going, it's a bit more efficient because it gives you more direct dimensional control. So I don't know. That was my experience. I don't know what you think, Dimitar.
Yeah, I have a slightly different take on it. When people say that Rhino when people say the Blender cannot be precise, yes, it cannot be precise, but it can also be very precise if you want it to be. So you do have the option, and I think a lot of people miss out on that. That you could still be precise. Of course, it doesn't have intersections, which and like trimming and all these kinds of things, which I think is the big advantage of a CAD software. But um, they just have different places. Like right now, for example, that I've become quite good and proficient at using Blender. I would never attempt creating an initial concept in Rhino. Never. Because I know I can do it and have the speed in Blender. At the same time, if I get some CAD data, or let's say some Revit data, maybe even concept from colleagues or clients, then I would probably uh, utilize Rhino for editing a lot of that or adding extra elements into it. And then if I need to have something a little bit more intricate in regards to modeling, then I'll go into Blender and then import that back into Rhino. And Blender allows you to be both very precise but very loose when you need to be. Whereas Rhino only allows you to be very precise. So everything there has to be like almost too exact. Of course, you can still be imprecise, if you're not snapping quite correctly or you're moving things quite fast. So that's the difference. And again, Blender has a lot of inherent non-destructiveness into it, whereas Rhino does not. It has a history tool, but it breaks very easily. Or you have the other end of the extreme, which is Grasshopper. But then if you're using Grasshopper for concepts, if your boss or client comes and says, actually, we need to think of a different concept, then you have to build a completely new Grasshopper script in many cases from scratch. So then there's always that question of timing, right? How long does it take you to create a script that maybe will only get used 2 times and then you might have to rebuild it versus explicitly modeling it? And if you are explicitly modeling, what is the most efficient way to do that?
Yeah.
Okay, so Blender is an authoring tool, but in my opinion, it lacks modern modeling tool. How this problem impacts ArcVis and how it can be solved? Can we do some pressure? Well, Blender's got like a very good basic tool set, and anybody's free to create an add-on or even submit patches to the master code. So if you have some ideas, you can discuss them with like communities and see if anybody's interested, or if you know how to code, you can also directly start coding a specific feature.
Yeah, I think the Blender Studio itself, I mean the Blender Foundation, it has a main focus which is gaming and animation. So some features, for example, NURBS, they will never be the priority for the main development of Blender because it's not needed for that field. So I think that, I mean, if we are part of a niche and we want to have to promote a little bit the use of Blender and improve some of the features, we have to do them ourselves, or or maybe yeah, or maybe collect people and create like a project for working a little bit more. For example, what I like is that the open movie project that are made with Blender by the Blender Studio, they are actually a very important step for the development of the software, because for every Blender open movie project, they start developing a lot of new features that then they develop for the movie, they test it and they improve it, and then they share with the community. So it would be nice to have like an open project, architectural project made with that logic. So a lot of designers gathering, making a nice project and start developing new features and brainstorming about them and releasing the new features, and then also having a project that they can use to showcase what Blender is capable of. That would be nice. In dream.
Definitely. And there is actually some discussion on that topic already in OSArch, the
Okay,
link I posted in the chat, where there is one studio that's called Opening Design, and they're an open source architecture studio. So they post all their projects. So they also have they're experienced guys. So they also have a library of details, construction details in 3D, where people can freely access it from their GitHub.
nice. I mean, if you think about that, I mean, an architectural company, especially the big ones, they spend a lot of money in licenses for softwares, while they could like collaborate with others and maybe gather some fundings and then pay a developer which can develop all the things that they're missing and maybe make something that is not even in the market yet with other softwares. So I think it's really about finding a good organization, because I think that there are resources, there is the willing to have some open source product, and a lot of people really like Blender. And I think it's just about organizing it properly, and I think a lot of things can be done.
So most big architecture companies these days, they do have their in-house design technology teams that are coding plugins. So they're on top of the subscription pricing, for Autodesk products, they're also developing the key features that are required for the office to function that are not included with Revit, let's say. So they do spend a lot of resource, but they spend it on top of this software that they don't own, right? So it's really bizarre when you think about it, because
Mm.
they have they're so it's a they're investing so much money into a company that they have no control over. And imagine now if, like you say, maybe a company has 5 developers, and one of those people is actually working on an alternative tool and making it, contributing to something that's open source. Because what I've realized is that a lot of the big companies that are coding like their old plugins for Revit, for missing, like, let's say, documentation and things like that, they're all doing the same things, right? So they're all replicating each other's work because that software doesn't have those functions that they need to.
No, that's true. Actually, when I decided at the beginning to share tissue, was indeed for that reason. I mean, I'm doing that. I'm pretty sure someone else is doing that or will do that as well. So,
Mm.
okay, instead of doing my version and then someone else comes and has his own version, I mean, okay, let's make it available, free, open, so that could be like a basis for a dialogue and a collaboration. It didn't happen because I'm mostly a single developer for that, but the idea was there.
Mm. Well, if anybody's interested, you're welcome to contribute to Tissue's code. It's hosted on GitHub.
I know it's a mess, but probably that's one of the reasons.
Right. So Steve has some more comments. So that's good to, to know that there are plugins add-ons to Pimify a model. Now I definitely need to jump in and learn. Yes, it's a great time to learn Blender for sure. And then he says, so Blender models can be used for G code and 3D print. Yes, Blender, you can basically export any 3D model as an STL and 3D print it. On top of that, Alessandro, please tell us more about the G code goodness that you've done.
Yeah, I mean, initially started as a Sverchok node for exporting the G code. Then I created a, then it became part of Tissue, I guess. And then I said, okay, no, let's make something different. So there is now an add-on that is a G code exporter that you can use to export G code from Blender. But it's not a slicing add-on. So you cannot slice a 3D model with that and export the G code. You can just take curves. For example, this can be used, for example, in concrete 3D printing or clay 3D printing when you really want to draw exactly some specific path or playing with that. So you can have curves and then you can export them as G code to use for printing. On top of that, there are some features in Tissue for doing some contouring slicing. So you can do some simple slicing using Tissue, using the contouring, and then export as G-code using the G-code exporter. So in theory, you could kind of use as a very simple and basic slicer. But I mean, if you have to do a normal slicing, I would say let's use just a Cura or a Prusa slicer, and we do a much better job. But if instead you want to play with the G code is a to the printing path and make something very specific, then you can draw that in Blender and export.
Yeah, and then Steven says, I know you need a step file to generate G code for concrete 3D printing. And I guess I imagine that step file probably would include um, a vector line, basically, wouldn't it?
Step file, I guess this depends on how. I'm not sure that's no, I don't think that's a requirement in general. Maybe in some specific workflows it may be, but I mean I worked in SDU University in Denmark until 1 month ago, and I had some colleagues that were working with concrete 3D printing, and they were just making the paths directly in a Grasshopper. Blender does not export step file because a step file is mostly a surface kind of a NURBS file, and
Yeah.
unfortunately Blender cannot export that. So what I did in the past when I needed that, I was converting a mesh into steps, I think in Rhino or in FreeCAD maybe, but it's something that I don't recommend usually.
You can cheat that. Like I use OBJ actually as a polyline. And if you know what you're doing, you can recreate your NURBS line from your polyline.
Okay. Stephen is saying also that some of the slicers need a step file. Okay. So that's a specific requirement for those slicers, but I wouldn't say that this is kind of a common requirement. That looks something quite specific.
Oh, he's back to right. Yeah, Rhino is it's a must. I think it's a great piece of software. Really, some of it you can replicate actually with FreeCAD because FreeCAD does step file. It does have fairly decent um, coding as well. Where you can do Python codes with FreeCAD, so it can replicate a lot of what you have. But Rhino is one thing, but Rhino with Grasshopper is quite hard to replicate.
But yeah, to be honest, I think that the Rhino community and the Blender community they can be quite friends, if we can say, we can put in that way. I mean, at the end, I think that one of the developers of Rhino is developing the 3DM importer in Blender, which is quite
Yes,
cool.
yes, and he
So
also incorporated cycles in Rhino. So
yes,
he
exactly.
worked for McNeil, who are the developers of Rhino, but he has also participated and continues to participate sometimes in the development of Blender.
So I mean, if you think a scenario where Autodesk is kind of owning a lot of software in the industry, I think it's good that there is also an alternative which involves Rhino and Blender, and together they can kind of cover a lot, I would
Yeah,
say.
cool. So we're running at about an hour and a half. So we it was a great conversation, and if anybody has firing, if you want to fire to us, one last question, please do so. Otherwise, I think maybe an hour and a half is probably beyond most people's spans of attention these days. So,
Yeah, probably.
so it'd be a good time to wrap up. But Alessandro, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you,
Uh,
Dimitar.
it's great. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll see how it goes. Maybe we'll try again. We'll try to practice a little bit. I will try to practice a little bit more to get the technology right next time. And sorry for the delay, and thank you for bearing with us. And you can support Alessandro. He has a Patreon, which helps him develop tissue a lot.
You can also support Dimitar, which is kind of being an evangelist for Blender user in architecture.
Yes, and I also have a Patreon as well, so I'll actually drop the links down in case you guys want to support us. And you can also join if you haven't yet. So, the Blender for Computational Design group uh, on Facebook, and in there we post all kinds of things, including experiments from the community. Cool. So, see you guys next time, and yeah, feel free to comment on the video if you have more
Yeah,
questions.
we'll keep an eye on that and we'll try to answer.
Take care, everybody. Have a good, wonderful day.
Bye bye, everyone. Bye bye.
Bye bye.